In the condition of right or law, then, the ethical world and the religion of that world are submerged and lost in the cosmic consciousness. And the unhappy consciousness is the knowledge of this total loss. It has lost both the worth it attached to its immediate personality and the worth attached to its personality as mediated, as thought. Trust in the eternal laws of the gods has vanished, and the oracles which pronounced on particular questions are dumb. The statues are now only stones from which the living soul has flown, just as the hymns are words from which belief has gone. The tables of the gods provide no spiritual food and drink, and in his games and festivals man no longer recovers the joyful consciousness of his unity with the divine. The works of the muse now lack the power of the spirit, for the spirit has gained its certainty of itself from the crushing of gods and men. They have become what they are for us now, beautiful fruit already picked from the tree, which a friendly fate has offered us, as a girl might set the fruit before us. It cannot give us the actual life in which they existed, not the tree that bore them, not the earth and the elements which constituted their substance, not the climate which gave them their particular character, nor the cycle of the changing seasons that govern the process of their growth. So fate does not restore their world to us along with the works of antique art. It gives not the spring and summer of the ethical life in which they blossomed and ripened, but only the veiled recollection of that actual world. Our active enjoyment of them is therefore not an act of divine worship through which our consciousness might come to its perfect truth and fulfillment. It is an external activity, the wiping off of some drops of rain or specks of dust from these fruits, so to speak, one which erects an intricate scaffolding of the dead elements of their outward existence, the language, the historical circumstances, etc., in place of the inner elements of the ethical life which environed, created, and inspired them. And all this we do not in order to enter into their very life, but only to possess an idea of them in our imagination. But just as the girl who offers us the plucked fruits is more than the nature which directly provides them, the nature diversified into their conditions and elements, the tree, air, light, and so on, because she sums all this up in a higher mode, in the gleam of her self-conscious eye and in the gesture with which she offers them, so too the spirit of the fate that presents us with those works of art is more than the ethical life and the actual world of that nation. For it is in the inwardizing in us of the spirit which in them was still only outwardly manifested. It is the spirit of the tragic fate which gathers all those individual gods and attributes of the divine substance into one pantheon, into the spirit that is itself, conscious of itself, as spirit. Paragraph 753 is a longer one, coming on the heels of a number of shorter paragraphs leading us into this revealed religion section, which is the final shape for religion. And you notice that in this particular paragraph, we're going to have an invocation of the unhappy consciousness and an explanation of what it is. So we've got a kind of revisioning going back to this earlier section. We'll have to talk about that in just a moment. And we have some really interesting observations made on Hegel's part about the capacity that people have in not just our own time or Hegel's own time, but even earlier in the possibility of taking on an earlier gestalt, an earlier shape of consciousness, and not just an earlier shape of consciousness in a, you might say, individualistic, let's try something out form, like, the law of the heart and the frenzy of self-conceit, which could be done on an individual basis as well as in a more cultural, societal way, but also forms that themselves are not just forms of consciousness, shapes of consciousness, but you could say overarching intergenerational forms of life, which is what the religion of art represents for us, as well as the other matters that it's connected with in terms of ethical life. So can we actually go backwards? In what ways can we? Obviously, if we're referencing it all, we can, but what are we actually doing? Can we jump back into pagan antiquity and recover anything remotely like what pagan antiquity was offering its worshipers and its, you might say, cultural producers and consumers? Is that a possibility in the present? And I'll say right off the bat, Hegel tells us, for example, in his philosophy of history and his history of philosophy, the answer is no. At a certain point he says, listen, nobody can actually be an Epicurean or a Stoic these days, and it goes for other things as well. Why? Because we are in a radically different milieu. We'll go back to that in a moment, because I think this raises some interesting problems for us, the 21st century readers of a Hegel who is writing from a perspective and a culture that is much more Christian than our own. So there's a lot to be said there. And there's also this beautiful metaphor to explore of the girl offering us a fruit. What does that mean? Well, we'll have to get into that. So let's start at the start. In this condition of right or law, so that's Recht, Zustand, right? Right or law, either one is fine. That's just Recht. And then the Zustand, this condition, this everybody being essentially caught up within the same matrix, all of the differentiation that was involved in the ethical world and its religion having been leveled. How so? Well, Hegel talks a little bit later there of the gods and men having been brought low, right? So that's an example of this. It also ties in with this comic consciousness, which is essentially not everything's so funny, but more of a sardonic, bitter consciousness, which corresponds to a significant degree to what is going on in certain parts of the spirit section as well, and what Hegel thought was happening in some of the comic literature of his own time, but also happening in ancient times. What would be examples of this? I think the prime example would be the Satyricon of Petronius Arbiter, right? If you wanted to pick a particular thing, there's all sorts of crazy stuff happening, and people are trying to seek their meaning to life, and then there's this encounter with the Sibyl that anybody who's read the work, it's stuck with them. Somebody sees the Sibyl in a jar at Cumae and asks, what do you want? And the Sibyl, this oracle, says, I want to die. The ancient world was, in many respects, falling apart. This is something that often gets left out by those who want to have a return to antiquity, right? They, first of all, generally don't know enough about antiquity, so they laud the Spartans, even though the Spartans would kill them on first sight, or they think they want to go back to ancient Athens or ancient Rome. But they also don't realize the hollowing out of that culture that Hegel has pointed out through the developments in the religion of art, right? And also back in the spirit section. So, a lot being said there. Let's go on with the text. In this condition of right or law, the ethical world, right, as an entire Welt, and the religion of that world are submerged, lost in the comic consciousness. And the unhappy consciousness, here Hegel is revaluing what the unhappy consciousness is about, is the knowledge of this total loss. Loss of the ethical world. Loss of what the earlier religion could provide. That's why you move to the unhappy consciousness. That's why, for example, Judaism could attract all sorts of non-Jews to its worship and celebrations. That's why Christianity could spread. That's probably also why Manichaeism connected to Christianity could spread throughout the empire. And we could chart this out in a larger sense if we wanted to, on a world historical basis, but we'll put that aside for the moment because Hegel doesn't do that. What is the unhappy consciousness? If we go back to the unhappy consciousness section, what we see over and over again is that the human being and the human beings together have realized that there's something greater than what they had previously thought, and they project it outside of themselves as a religious object, as something to be worshipped, as something to be united with, as something to be served, as we could go on and on. Go back to the unhappy consciousness section if you want to review that. There's many different modalities, all the way to bells and smells, as we sometimes joke about within liturgical Christianity, talking about people using censers and bells and things like that, which Hegel talks about. What is the goal? It is to recover a relationship with the divine that is part of oneself, that is humanity writ large projected out there, but we're not realizing that. Now, how did we arrive at that point earlier on in the self-consciousness section? Well, we first had the master-slave dialectic, and we've got production and development of consciousness. Then we have Stoicism, which we've already talked about just a little bit in this other section. And then we have skepticism. And skepticism is another shape of what Hegel here is calling the comic consciousness, right? That we concluded the last section with. And then we move into the unhappy consciousness. So that is essentially a social philosophical progression. Here we have a religious progression tied in with a way of life, an overarching cosmos that we are connected with, and in which the gods and we, move and have our being, you could say, and are shaped in this pantheon. And that's lost. And the unhappy consciousness is the consciousness of that loss. Verlust, a total loss, right? And what is this total loss? Hegel is going to specify this to us. It has lost both the worth it attached to its immediate personality, and here he actually uses the term Selbstwert, right? So it's not worth, it's valuation of self that it had attached to its immediate personality, Personalität, right? And also as it attached to, it mediated and as thought as something that is thought, not as thinking, as gedacht, right? So the unhappy consciousness is an advance, but it's an advance into the negative. It sure as hell doesn't feel good to be the unhappy consciousness. It's unglücklich, right? It's unhappy. So what has it actually lost? Here's where we get a whole listing. And Hegel's being comprehensive here. Rather than just sketching a few things, he actually runs through a number of matters. Trust in the eternal laws of the gods has vanished. So, the divine law that was there. What else? The oracles which pronounced on particular questions are dumb. They have nothing to say. The statues are now only stones from which the living soul has flown. The statues still exist. The oracle still exists, but there's nothing there anymore. Just as the hymns are words from which belief has gone. All of these wonderful hymns that we have preserved to Apollo, to Demeter, to Zeus, to pick whoever you want, none of them mean anything as hymns anymore. They can be looked at as, wonderful poetry, but they're not what they used to be. What else? The tables of the gods provide no spiritual food and drink. And here we're talking not just about tables set out in front of us, we're talking about the cult, which played such a massively important role earlier on throughout the entire religion section. The cult was a massive achievement. And now it's no longer providing what it used to, right? A sort of communion between gods and human beings. We could say the same thing about the architecture. We could say the same thing about the decorations. In his games and festivals, man no longer recovers the joyful consciousness of his unity with the divine. The games and festivals still go on, but now there's something worldly rather than something transcendent. Finally, the works of the muse now lack the power of the spirit. What were the works of the muse? Well, these new forms of language, epic poetry, tragedy, and comedy. Why? Well, we saw this happen in the previous section. The spirit has gained its certainty of itself from the crushing of gods and men. And what do all these things become? Here's the next side of it. They have become what they are for us now. So Hegel is saying something not just about what happens in the ancient world in this transition to different forms of religion. He's also talking about us. And a good question we can ask ourselves is, does the us that Hegel is discussing, does it manage to extend itself to us 2 centuries in advance? Or are we a bit too different now, right? So he says, what have they become? Beautiful fruit already picked from the tree. The fruit is no longer on the tree. The fruit has been picked, so it's ripe, which a friendly fate, a Schicksal, has offered us, as a girl might set the fruit before us. And this girl is going to come back in just a moment. We'll have to say what the girl is. But first, what is the fruit? Well, the fruit is something that we can regard, something that we can consume, but we can't actually have the totality of the fruit. We can't have, to use a word that Hegel's not bringing in here, it in terms of Begriff, in terms of the totality of things that have gone into it that we could conceptualize. And what do these include? Well, obviously the tree. It can't give us the tree that bore them. And this is something worth thinking about, You cannot get the hours and hours of thought and rewritings and reflection and dead ends that produced this book that Hegel brought forth, right? This is the fruit. We don't get the tree. I mean, we get Hegel as kind of a tree. We see him producing other things. That's kind of nice. But we don't have anything of the tree itself. And, in a way, this is a bit of a side note, we often measure our own thought as philosophers or as students of philosophy against these greats who we encounter. And we, read Hegel, or we read Descartes, or we read Aristotle, or we pick whoever else you want, and we're like, oh my gosh, they are so smart compared to us. Boy, I, rarely have 3 good thoughts in a day. Look at this. This is like a cornucopia of brilliant thoughts, or perhaps, maybe brilliant, but I'm not quite sure I understand them, but people say they're brilliant, right? Well, this is because we're looking at the finished product. It's sort of like judging a, LP album produced in the studio by a band and then looking at all the noodling and playing around with riffs and false starts and let's get rid of this section of the song. Now we got to put in a drum track. These are 2 different things, right? So the tree is one thing that they're missing, but there's more than just a tree, right? It cannot give us the tree, and then what else? It cannot give us the tree that bore them, not the earth and the elements which constituted their substance. What was taken in to the fruit? We know that plants are things that react to their environment, right? Actually, in terms of some things, we might even have animals involved in some way. We certainly have pollinators involved, but sometimes, there's wasps and figs and things like that. Nor the climate, which gave them their particular character. What in winemaking they call terroir, right? The terrain, the landscape in which these grapes grow this way. Because, the sun shines in a certain way and there's a certain amount of rain and the soil has certain elements in it and there's certain pests and a lack of other certain pests. All that goes into making the fruit what it is. Even beyond that, not the cycle of changing seasons that govern the process of their growth. The temporality is not there in the fruit either. It produced the fruit. It's the product of an end process of temporality, right? But we don't have that time that it took. Other than perhaps, fruit that's been raised too quickly may taste mealy. It doesn't have the fullness of its possibilities. It's been done artificially. It has to have been done, in some respect, naturally. Coming back to a little bit earlier in this, he tells us that this friendly fate has offered us the fruit as a girl might set the fruit before us. It cannot give us the actual life, wirkliche Leben, in which these things existed. Right? He goes on and says, fate does not restore their world to us along with the works of antique art. It gives not the spring and summer of the ethical life in which they blossomed and ripened. Now, spring and summer, these are the actual seasons for growing fruit, right? At first, the fruit is merely a blossom that has to be pollinated, right? There has to be this process of reproduction. Then we have summer. The fruit begins to grow and the sun is shining down and things are happening within the fruit. The tree is contributing to it. And only then in the fall, there's summer fruit, of course, but let's just stick to this. Only then in the fall is it ripe enough for us to take it. And the summer and the spring are gone. Well, this is an interesting metaphor for cultural production, is it not? So he says, all we get is the veiled recollection of that actual world. That was a real world. The people of antiquity were real human beings. They may not have realized spirit in the way that we do in the present, or even the way that was done, say, in the Enlightenment, or in the unhappy consciousness, but they were real. They were real human beings. They had something to preoccupy them. Something gave their lives centrality and meaning, and for many it was this form of religion, or the many forms of religion that fit into this super form of religion. So what do we do? What happens when we're talking about this? When I teach a Religions of the World class and we talk about ancient Greek and Roman religion, and there's always somebody who's like, yeah, I'm really into Hellenism, and you kind of look at them and you're like, yeah, that ain't what was being practiced back then. Same thing with people who are like, I'm reviving Norse religion. Well, Hegel would say without an ethical world, that's not really feasible. You can cosplay, you can LARP doing that sort of thing, but it's not really the same thing. And instead, what's a better perspective on this? Appreciation, right? He tells us our active enjoyment of them, we can have active enjoyment of all this stuff, of oracles, statues, hymns, these tables, games and festivals, works of the muse. Some a little bit less than the others. Works of the muse tends to be what we concentrate on. And very often we're just reading these in text form. We're not having a bard recite Homer to us in our, dimly lit hall or something like that at a festival. We're not actually watching the tragedies played out on a stage, but we can get some idea of it, and we can appreciate it, and we can read hymns and get something out of it. But what do we get out of it? He says, this is not an act of divine worship through which our consciousness might come to its perfect truth and fulfillment. It is an external activity. What we're getting out of it from the perspective of the unhappy consciousness is an external activity. He says, the wiping off of some drops of rain or specks of dust from these fruits, so to speak, one which erects an intricate scaffolding of the dead elements of their outward existence. So we do a scaffolding. And this is quite Hegel's attuned to this. You can't just pick up Homer and start going to town or walk around and look at Greek statuary and be like, oh, like in the Louvre, for example. There's all sorts of cool Greek statuary. You need to know something about that ethical world in order to more fully appreciate it. And interestingly, with statuary, we also know that you have to imagine these things as painted, not in the pristine white forms that we see them with, right? These were actually painted statues, and you have to imagine that colorfulness, that mottliness, right? So how do we do that? Hegel brings up two things as an example. Language, Sprache, right? If you want to understand Plato, it helps to learn Greek. If you want to understand something having to do with Rome, a lot of them actually wrote in Greek because there was a kind of inferiority complex in relation to Greek on the part of Latin speakers. Where do we learn this from? A great example of that is Cicero, who talks about it over and over again as he attempts to undo that. Now notice what we're doing here. We're filling in background stuff. So talking about language, but also talking about the historical, the historische, right? Here Miller translates this as historical circumstances, but it goes beyond just circumstances. Knowing some things about the background and real things, not just stuff from Wikipedia, not just things from memes or, God forbid, from inaccurate television or movies or things like that. Well, it really helps you appreciate it. And interestingly, as a bit of a side note, if all you have is a consumption of basically fake antiquity stuff that's oriented in the culture wars of today, you would go to the Louvre and you wouldn't be able to appreciate the statues in the way that somebody who actually knows something about ancient times would. Same thing goes for the medieval times. Same thing goes for orientalizing pictures of things happening in India or China with, you say, Buddhist art. You really got to actually know something in order to appreciate, don't you? So going on, he says, these things are what we use in place of the inner elements of the ethical life which environed, created, and inspired them, right? There was a process of internal development that took place that we can only kind of pick at on the outside. Now, here he talks about the girl. Just as the girl who offers us the plucked fruits is more than the nature which directly provides them, the nature diversified into their conditions, elements, the tree, air, light, so on. Why? Because she sums all this up in a higher mode. Now notice the way that Hegel talks about this. In the gleam of her self-conscious eye and in the gesture, the Gebärde, with which she offers them, so too, right? So we've got a girl not just mechanically offering us fruit, but aware of herself as preferring these things to us, as engaging in a gesture, as having a gleam in her eye, as having intentionality and agency. What's the girl in this case? Well, the girl is fate, but now he calls it the spirit, the Geist of the fate that presents us with these works of art. Why does it present us with these works of art? Because this is part of our background, our heritage, whatever we want to call it, right? it's something that we have access to, more or less. I mean, so much of antiquity has been lost, right? The spirit of faith that presents us with these works of art is more than the ethical life and the actual world of that nation. And here's where there's an interesting play on words. For it is the inwardizing in us of the Spirit, which in them was still only outwardly manifested. Inwardizing is Erinnerung, right? Inner, going inside. But Erinnerung also means something like remembering or recollection. There's a possibility of recollection available to us that, of course, was not available to those who were living it, because, I mean, they could remember what happened in their lifetime, and they could remember memorial events like, oh, the Battle of Marathon, ooh, so good, you know. We have a different sort of Erinnerung going on, a different sort of memorializing in our own time in relation to these works of art, the fruit. And he goes on and he says, it is the spirit of the tragic fate which gathers all those individual gods and attributes of the divine substance into one pantheon, into the spirit that is itself conscious of itself as spirit. Now you notice we're already in talking about that, we're kind of moving past the unhappy consciousness. There, at the end of this paragraph, and of course this is just the beginning of this section, there's this hint that we are able to appreciate and to grasp all this stuff in the past, which might also include, for some of us, the unhappy consciousness. And we're also able to grasp the spirit that is itself conscious of itself as spirit, an advance that is taking place. So this is pretty important stuff that's going on here in this section. This is already quite long, but I do want to close by raising one interesting issue. The unhappy consciousness, right? We can't have access, according to Hegel, to the ethical worlds of the past in the sense of those who were living them. And we could talk about those that are closer to him in time, a broken ethical world, for example, of the Enlightenment that he is part of, although Hegel is also part of you can call it an Enlightenment, critical Enlightenment, what I called in the past the Second Enlightenment. But the unhappy consciousness, in some respects, looks like it's, much, much earlier. It maybe extends into the Middle Ages. Can we really belong to that sort of ethical community or spiritual community if we've gotten past the Sittliche, the ethical community of the ancient world? Can we really belong to that today? Can we be trads, as they say, and lament the burning of Notre Dame, or any of these sorts of things, as if we were members of that? And I think Hegel would say, well, not really. We can't really be the unhappy consciousness in its original sense, but maybe there's another formulation or reworking of it that's going on in this entire section.